I've enjoyed immensely all that has been taught here this week, and it's been such a privilege to be a part of these studies and to be able to be with each one of you and to glean so much from these things that have been presented by these speakers. We're most fortunate to have men like Brother Hugo McCord and these others that have spoken to us throughout the day, and to see the fine and outstanding talent of men like Neil Pryor and others who are holding up that same pattern of truth that has been taught through the years. And we commend the congregation here for all of its great work, but especially for this work that has such an extension to it. I don't know of any series of lectures anywhere that has had more wide appeal and the subjects that have been discussed sought more after by serious-minded students than the Fort Worth lectures through all the years, even from the time that it was Fort Worth Christian College lectures. And it's meant a great deal to each one of us. I'd like for you to open your Bibles, please, to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26, because this is really the basis of the first problem that we're going to be discussing from the book of Zechariah. As Brother Neil Pryor pointed out, Ezekiel went into bondage by the river Kibar in about 597, and this chapter begins in chapter 26 by saying that it was in the 11th year that these things happened. So that makes this occasion 586 BC. And that's the time that the temple has been destroyed. Maybe word has gotten back over to the river Kibar about this, and there are some prophecies that deal with Tyre, because Tyre, that Phoenician city and that great powerhouse of its day, has been rejoicing in the news that Jerusalem has been destroyed. And they're so thrilled over the fact that now they think that they have some greater opportunities than ever before. And so it may have been about February that these things are taking place. But Tyre shouldn't laugh at the destruction of Jerusalem and its fate, because it's not going to be but just a few months until they're going to meet a certain doom. And this begins that, verse 2, Son of man, because that Tyre hath said against Jerusalem, Aha! She is broken. That was the gate of the peoples. She is turned unto me. I shall be replenished now that she's laid waste, the she being Jerusalem. And he said, don't get too happy, because you're going to run into your problems. And then the prophecy that Tyre is going to be destroyed. A prophecy that is a most unique prophecy. But now if this happened in 586 beginning, and as we'll be discussing, the siege that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who was already king at that time, would bring against Tyre, would end in the destruction of Tyre, how could it be that 68 years later, we find in the book of Zechariah, a prophecy dealing with this same city, that it shall be destroyed. If it's been destroyed, as Ezekiel said, by Nebuchadnezzar, how on earth could it have been destroyed in the future from the day of Zechariah? If Zechariah is writing 68 years after the events that would only take up 13 years, or thereabouts, from the time that the prophecy of Ezekiel had been made. And this presents a problem that we want to be dealing with. And it comes from next to the last book of the Old Testament, and we'll be discussing that. And one problem in the last book, and I think that it underscores the fact that God hasn't abdicated His universal right to rule, and He does things according to the accuracy of His promise, and He does things in His own timing, and by His own way fulfills whatever it is that He has so designed. I have been most impressed through the years by a statement that Brother Robert Bell used to make, who taught at Abilene Christian College. He would say, God is the hinge upon which all human history turns. Let's never forget that fact. Everything, all nations turn upon God. Solomon recognized that. David knew it. And thus, 1 Chronicles chapter 29 says, in thine hand is power and might, and in thine hand it is to make great and to give strength unto all. God can tear down, and He can build up, and He doesn't have to wait for it to be accomplished. He can accomplish it immediately if He so desires. But if He wants to take time in accomplishing it, He can do just that. But it will be done. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. The Lord is not slack concerning His promise. Now the promise under discussion there, and it's in the singular, is the promise that the world will come to an end and that Jesus will bring this back at His coming, that He will bring about these matters. So where's the promise of His coming, is what scoffers had been saying. And Peter says the Lord is not slack concerning His promise to come again. Well, it's true that He's not slack concerning that promise, but the same thing is a principle that we need to keep in mind concerning all of the promises of God. He's never slack concerning any promise that He makes. A lot of questions have been raised about passages, and I think that evidently someone has been doing a lot of study, and we need to profit from it if there are conclusions to be drawn. However, I found that a lot of people may raise questions just to be raising questions and trying to cloud the issue rather than to try to find the truth. And I believe that this week will help us so much in finding the truth. And we'll let God be the judge of the purpose back of some questions. But our purpose is to try to find out what God has said upon that subject and to find out what the answer is. So, in view of this prophecy that's found in Ezekiel 26, if you'll hold your place there, you may want to turn over to Zechariah 9 and verse 1 and the following verses. Some think that they find a contradiction between the prophets Zechariah and Ezekiel. Both foretell the doom of Tyre. Now the problem is that Ezekiel said the city would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. He even calls him there in chapter 26 of Ezekiel by name. It says he's going to come down and he's going to destroy this city. And Zechariah, at least 44 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, said, Jerusalem shall be destroyed. Now, if it's to be destroyed at a later time, did Nebuchadnezzar in his lifetime do what he said he would do? And therefore, how could Zechariah make this prophecy that he makes in chapter 9? And verse 1 to 4, I think that you can see very clearly that the prophecy that Zechariah has before us is one that involves something that would happen later, and which was fulfilled in 332 by Alexander the Great, who swept down through that area and demanded that all the cities open their gates, and when Tyre refused, he destroyed Tyre. Now the problem revolves around the statement in Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 14. I think we can center on it. Speaking of Tyre, Ezekiel prophesied, and I will make thee a bare rock. Thou shalt not be a place Thou shalt be a place for the spreading of nets. Thou shalt be built no more, for I, Jehovah, have spoken it. Now, how could Tyre be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BC, and then be built no more, and yet be destroyed by Alexander in the 4th century BC, actually 240 years later? How could that be possible? Now, as insurmountable as that may seem at first glance, I think there's an evident and a very intriguing solution to that problem. The book of Zechariah can be divided into several different sections. The first 8 chapters, the Jews are encouraged to rebuild the temple which had lain in ruin since they had returned from Babylonian captivity. And most of the last 6 chapters do not deal with immediate events upon their return, but have to do with things that are in the distant future, especially those things that lead up to the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and including the events of His life in prophetic terms. Now, the first section of the book of Zechariah is in the 2nd year of Darius. And, of course, the last section, he says, is 2 years later, and that would be about 518 BC that Zechariah writes this. And most of the last 6 chapters are delineating events that are still in the far distant future from the year 518 BC. In chapters 9 and 10, the prophet says that there are some things that are going to occur before the coming of Christ, during the Grecian rule of the world. That is, while Alexander the Great and the Grecians would be under control. And after that, Rome would arise. And chapter 11 brings you to that time. And then it concludes with the rest of the book dealing with the time of the Messiah, messianic events foretold, including the death of Jesus and the accomplishments that He would bring about. Now in chapter 9, dealing in that last section that deals with the Grecian period, the first portion sketches the conquest that would certainly be fulfilled when Alexander the Great in 332 sweeps down with his army. And Zechariah clearly prophesies what's going to be the result of the work of Alexander the Great. He begins this chapter by using the term the burden. A burden was a threatening prediction. The burden of the Lord. Something the Lord's threatening and predicting that will come to pass. And He represents several cities, some of them including Syria, Phoenicia, and Philistia. And then He comes to this Phoenician city of Tyre. Tyre was a very beautiful city. It had a great history connected with it. It was a very old city. It was a center of seafaring commerce, as the Phoenicians were so well noted. It was a city that was known for its beautiful glassware and silver, and because of its purple dye-making industry. It was a very wealthy city and a powerful city. And it was one that had some people connected with it that you perhaps have read about in history. Origen, that prolific scholar, was buried in that very place in about 250, I think 254 A.D. When he died. Not only that, but they built a larger basilica, church building there in the time that they had wandered from New Testament Christianity. And in the 4th century, that great father of history, Eusebius, came to Tyre and preached the sermon the day that they opened that larger basilica. It had been one that had been well noted. Now, when you read this threatening prediction, this burden, you will notice that it says, Tyre did build herself a stronghold. Actually, I'm told that in the Hebrew language there's a play on words here. And if we had them to sort of rhyme or sound alike, in our language, about the nearest we would get to it is to say, Tyre built herself a tower, because Tyre and tower sound alike. Tyre built herself a stronghold, and heaped up silver as dust, and fine gold as the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her. He will smite her power in the sea, and she shall be devoured with fire. Zechariah 9 and verse 1 to 4. Now 68 years after Zechariah, the prophet Ezekiel, before Zechariah, the prophet Ezekiel had said, I am against thee, O Tyre, and will cause many nations to come up against thee, as the sea causeth its waves to come up, and they shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers. I will also scrape her dust from her and make her a bare rock. She shall be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea. For I have spoken it, saith the Lord Jehovah, and she shall become a spoil of the nations. Ezekiel 26 and verse 3 to 6. Now that the inspired writers of both of these passages had the same city in mind can not be questioned. It's the same one. I will bring upon Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, said Ezekiel's prophecy. He shall set his battering engines against thy walls, and with axes he shall break down thy towers. He shall slay thy people with the sword, and the pillars of thy strength shall go to the ground. This reading, beginning with verse 7, is found in Ezekiel 26. Now the prophet went on through the remainder of this chapter and several other succeeding chapters to further speak of Tyre's doom. But there's an interesting turn just here in chapter 26 at verse 12. He's been talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and he. But then when he gets to verse 12, he switches and says, and they shall make a spoil of thy riches, and make a prey of thy merchandise. He switches from the singular to the plural. And destroy thy pleasant houses, and they shall lay thy stones and thy timber and thy dust in the midst of the waters. And I will cause the noise of thy songs to cease, and the sound of thy harp shall be no more heard. And I will make thee a bare rock. Thou shalt be built no more, for I, Jehovah, have spoken it. Now then, this change from the individual, he, a general subject then comes up, to they, and he doesn't say who they are, is still connected with what was a prophecy of the destruction of Tyre. Now, Ezekiel's prophecy has a wider scope than does Zechariah's. Ezekiel said what was initiated and begun by Nebuchadnezzar will be continued by others, and they will continue until Tyre no longer exist. Now, Ezekiel outlines 7 things that would have to be fulfilled before his prophecy is complete. Verse 7, Nebuchadnezzar, he names him, is going to destroy the city. Many nations would be against Tyre, and he says they'll come up as the waves of the sea. You ever watch the waves hit the seashore? One right after another. In other words, there are going to be nations after Nebuchadnezzar, and they're just going to continue to whip this nation. And about the time she thinks she's gaining her strength, there's going to be another wave, and another, and another. And many nations will come against her. Verse 3. And her dust, verse 4, would be scraped and made a bare rock. In other words, there's not going to be anything left. And then the fourth prophecy that he makes in verse 12 and verse 19 is that the debris of her ruins would be thrown into the sea, into the water, and she shall be built no more, was the fifth promise that was made in verse 14. And verse 21 said she'd never be found again. And then the seventh and final one is in verse 5. I'll back up to that one for the final one, because it says it would become a place not for commerce, that would be for seafaring industry, but a place for little fishermen that are just going out into the area. And they'll come back and throw their nets there on the shore. Now, every particular of that prophecy of God was carried out to a letter. Some commentators who were liberal in their thinking and modernistic in their ideas didn't think that this had ever been completed. Hitzig, in his commentary, declares that the passage in Ezekiel assigns the total destruction to Nebuchadnezzar, and then he states that it was a thing notoriously not accomplished. Well, it was accomplished exactly what God said. I think there are 3 points to consider. First, did God fulfill this prophecy by Nebuchadnezzar? And of course he did. He did just that. What he pictures in figures of speech were fulfilled. Whenever Jesus was born, we find the statement made that what began with his birth is really a summary of all that he accomplished in his life. There's born unto you this day a Savior. Well, he hadn't been crucified at that day, but it was the initiation of it. And so taking a part for a whole and using the figure of speech called a synecdoche, which is a very legitimate usage that we have in grammar even in our day, a part was put for the whole. And here in the initial part of this prophecy, Nebuchadnezzar initiates the destruction of Tyre. And what starts there can be said that Tyre shall be destroyed. But he doesn't say that Nebuchadnezzar would accomplish it all. For in the second place, we must note that historical evidence indicates that Nebuchadnezzar did destroy the mainland city of Tyre. Now, we know definitely that the Babylonian monarch came against Tyre, and it was such a hard city to take that he spent not just a few weeks or months trying to capture that city, but he spent 13 years with a siege on that city before anything happened. Now, Josephus has a quotation from a non-existent separate manuscript today. That is, we don't have the original manuscript that he's quoting from, but he quotes from Appian, and he says that after that 13-year siege, the mainland city of Tyre fell, and many of the people moved to the fortress island that was about a half mile out from the coast. There was a little island out there, rock fortress-like, and a part of the city had already been located out there, and so the ones that could went out there and continued their resistance. And it seems that Nebuchadnezzar took at no time the island city, but he did take the mainland city. Now, some insist that after he waged his siege, that finally after 13 years, Nebuchadnezzar just gave up. It was such a costly effort that he decided not to do any more. And some even turned to Ezekiel 29 in an attempt to prove that, because it says there in Ezekiel 29, verse 18, that Nebuchadnezzar caused his army to serve a great service against Tyre. That is a very expensive and long siege. Yet he had no wages nor his army from Tyre. That is, he never got any spoil out of it. And he never got any pay for it. Now, the argument is, if he had captured the city, he would have received the spoil of it. And so, evidently, some say Nebuchadnezzar never destroyed it. But I think that those are not the proper conclusions. Jerome says in his commentary that Tyre, while under attack, had secreted much of its wealth out of the city to other places. 13 years they had, and if they thought that they had any wealth, they wouldn't want it on the inside where a siege is going on. If they could at all slip it out, they would have done so. You would if you were inside a city under siege that long. And Jerome says that much of this was secreted away. And although it's true that there's no mention in any extant writings of victory by Nebuchadnezzar, there's an entire silence on the activities of Nebuchadnezzar from that point on. And so that would mean that Nebuchadnezzar didn't do anything, anywhere, after that 13-year siege. From that view, in the third place, that Nebuchadnezzar did conquer Tyre is quite certain from Josephus, who cites the writers Appian and quotes them. And he says that Tyre was taken. Now, there is proof in history that Tyre's monarchy ceased. Well, why would it cease? If they won the war against Nebuchadnezzar, why wouldn't they have continued? The ruling family didn't continue, and this, along with the fact that she fell, is the reason that Sidon, a little to the north, became the major city. Of course, it was only the coastal part that fell under Nebuchadnezzar. What about that island out there? It became the prominent part of Tyre. And when Alexander the Great came with his army, he said, "Open up your gates. I want access to all these cities, and I want your money, and I want your men." Sidon gave up, and the rest of them gave up, but not Tyre. That little hornet was out there on that island, and they didn't think anybody could attack. They had walls around that city, double thickness or casemate walls, as they're called, and they were located on an island, and they had big rocks all around it, and they had walls. I think they were 168 feet tall. I'm not exactly remembering the immediate height of the walls, but they were about 10 stories tall. And there had been many people that had come against Tyre, and whenever they'd come, they had hot sand that they had heated up on top of that wall, and they just pour it out on them. And they had hot pitch and melted lead. Now, you talk about shooting hot lead at somebody. They didn't have a gun to do it, but you pour out melted lead on an army down below, and it would fairly discourage some of them, I'm sure. Besides all the rocks and stones that they could catapult off of there, and all the spears and arrows that they could shoot. And there had been a lot of people try to take it. And then they'd throw torches on the sails of the ships if they'd come, and throw them on the decks, and they'd burn them. And Alexander the Great came through there, and he said, "I want this city." And they said, "I'm not going to give over to you." So Alexander started his siege. It didn't take him near as long as Nebuchadnezzar. He started gathering up a navy and bringing them. Well, they gave him the hot treatment too. Made Alexander the Great mad. He just took the ruins of that old coastal city. Ezekiel said now that this would happen. And Alexander said, "I'll just build me a causeway out there." And so he started scraping the ruins and throwing them in the water. And he built a 200-foot wide causeway out to the city on that island. Well, he used stones from the city and everything else and threw them down in there, and he walked out with his army and had his battering rams ahead of them, and they nearly whipped him right then. And so he withdrew, and he got him some taller machines. He had not only battering rams, but he had machines that were built up even taller than those high walls of the city. And they pushed those machines in front of them, and they had towers all the way up and down where they could shoot from any level, and where they could just send soldiers up and go right across, be protected somewhat. Finally, after less than a year's siege, he took the city and destroyed thousands upon thousands of the people, and took many thousands of them captive. And exactly what the prophet of God said would happen came to pass. But it took both the prophecy of Ezekiel and Zechariah's prophecy to tell the entire story. But it teaches, I think, an important lesson for us. God doesn't forget. He didn't even rest when Alexander the Great took it. It took away her great power. A little village remained there. And Alexander the Great used that village for his purposes, and that island for his commerce. But that's not what God said would happen to the city. He said she'd be destroyed totally. And it was in March of 1291 that finally the Germans lost the control and the Saracens won that city, and the Mohammedans that had driven out Christians in earlier centuries finally were all taken away from that place, and it became a bare rock. Today, there's another little town there, a little village. About 6,800 people live all around that coastal area, including the island. And only a northern part of the island has anything on it, but it's not Tyre. It's named El Sur, or Es Sur, as some give it. But it's not Tyre. None of that beautiful power of commerce and industry, that's all gone. But as I visited this place, and as I looked upon the things along the coast, I couldn't help but pause and take a picture. Because along that causeway that silt has made far wider than it was originally, some fishermen had brought nets and thrown them up on the bank, on the rocks. And that fulfilled, as it has for centuries now, what Ezekiel said would happen to that place. So both of the prophecies are true. And as Psalm 119 says in verse 89, "Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven." It is settled there. Earth can't shake it. Men may think that God forgets, but He doesn't. He remembers. His word is settled. How grateful we ought to be for a God like that. He never forgets. We do. And our forgetting seems to get more prominent through the years. I told the other day about a fellow who had become quite forgetful. I heard about two ladies that became quite forgetful. They met together and they were talking about it. One of them said, "You know, I'm 74 years old and I'm in a reasonable measure of health, knock on wood." But she said, "Sometimes I call somebody on the phone and by the time I've dialed the number, I can't remember who it is I called and I have to say, 'Who is this to whom I'm speaking?' when I made the call." And the second one said, "Well, since you've mentioned it, I'm 82 years old and in the best of health, knock on wood. Sometimes I go to the store and I mean to pick up some item and I forget what it was I was supposed to pick up until I got home." And the third little old frail lady said, "I'm 94 years of age and I'm in reasonably good health. Come in." It's easy to forget. But all of these prophecies that we've discussed in the book, from Zechariah and Malachi, are interesting prophecies. I discussed Zechariah 14. I'd just like to point out that I do not believe that that prophecy in Zechariah 14 deals with the second coming of Christ. Nor do I believe that it deals with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 A.D. That's been a prominent view among some of our brethren. Neil Wallace Debate has that as Brother Wallace's explanation. However, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D., there weren't any people left in the city. And yet, in Zechariah 14, there is the remainder of the city, still there. And in Zechariah 14, you have, I believe, simply a promise that when the Lord establishes His kingdom, His church, which He did in the first century A.D., that there would be these great blessings that would provide strength and joy and peace and protection to His people. And these are symbolic terms. Even Egyptians in the latter part of that chapter go up and keep the Feast of Tabernacles year by year continually. Now, if that's about the second coming of Christ, it means there's going to be an overthrow of the New Testament and its kind of worship and a return to the Feast of Tabernacles and to the Jewish law. And that'll never be. Not only that, but the whole world goes up to keep the Feast of the Tabernacles there in that chapter. And whoever doesn't keep the Feast of Tabernacles is killed. I believe that's symbolic language. It's simply a way of saying God is going to evermore bless His people. They worship Him. The worship they knew then in Zechariah's day was worship that included the Feast of Tabernacles, their most joyous occasion. And that type of joy would characterize their worship. And they would do this continually. And whoever didn't do that, whoever didn't worship God in spirit and truth, would not have His eternal approval. These are so great in the scope that they have, and how marvelous it is for us to see the power of God to carry out His purposes and to be the hinge upon which all human history still turns and always will until He says this world will be no more.